ولا تجد على ألسنة المسلمين يرددون سوى كيف قام الفعل الفلاني وأمريكا غير راضية، وكيف نجح الفعل الفلاني وروسيا غاضبة، وكأنها أصبحت تعالى الله عما يظنون علوا كبيرا، كأن أمريكا وروسيا أصبحت إلها من دون الله سبحانه. لماذا؟
Jihad and the rifle alone, no negotiations, no conferences, and no dialogue. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the second episode of the Adab Book Club. In this segment we conclude with our literary examination and review of Dr. Abdullah Azzam's legacy, following on from the first episode, which delved into the lofty mountain. In this episode we will review Join the Caravan. This episode will also delve deeper into the life and person of Abdullah Azzam, chronicling his journey from his early childhood in Jenin through to his martyrdom in 1989. Before we continue, a reminder, our reviews are objective and purely literary. This is not an endorsement nor is a condemnation for the content found in these books. It is purely for educational purposes. For those interested in joining the Adab Book Club, a link to the private chat group on Telegram is available on screen and in the description section below. Now let us continue with our review of the second book, Join the Caravan. With this biography, we record the events of Islamic history in the 20th century, which took place in a decade from 1979 to 1989. Arguably the most eventful and cataclysmic decade for the Muslims since the decline and eventual fall of the Ottoman Empire between 1914 and 1924, the nexus and pivot of the Islamic world was disoriented in 1924 and completely reconfigured by 1979, a day that coincides with the turning of the new Islamic century, the year 1400 after Hijrah, in which the Iranian Revolution emerges victorious in February 1979, igniting the Muslim world with hope and encouragement.
Khomeini's name was the rallying cry that brought down the Shah, and now to his followers waiting outside the airport, he's the implacable opponent of Dr. Bastiar's government.
By November 1979, the Muslim world would be awakened to a most horrific series of events when a band of vigilantes from the Islamic University of Medina, under the leadership of Juhayman al-Utaybi and the so-called Mahdi, captured the Haram in Mecca and confronted Saudi Arabian authorities in a deadly siege that claimed the lives of many pilgrims, striking fear and shock into the collective heart of the Ummah.
لقد كانت البداية المأساوية الأليمة جرحا عميقا في ضمير الأمة الإسلامية، وكان ما كان من أمر الطغاة المفسدين. فجأة أصبح بيت الله الحرام كما ترون خلوا من تلك الآلاف، خلوا من أفواج المؤمنين بعد أن سيطر عليه الخارجون.
Then began the fateful incident. After the faithful ended their prayers, stood up a man speaking, and the band of renegades, the band of those who were, it seems, outside the boundaries of the faith, spread fear and preached the untruth.
The penultimate pivot came a few days before the end of this most ominous year, when on Christmas Eve 1979, the Muslim world was once again startled by news of the Soviet Union's military invasion of Afghanistan.
By all accounts, the Soviet takeover was meticulously planned and skillfully executed, but it has not been clear just how the Soviets were able to set up their coup without the Afghans realizing what they had in mind.
This moment was so pivotal that it marked the commencement of a totally new chapter in the struggle for Islamic liberation. In fact, it was in 1979 that the global jihad truly took root. I feel that I am 9 years old, 7.5 years in the Afghan jihad, 1.5 years in the jihad in Palestine, and the rest of the years have no value. Dr. Abdullah Azzam was born in 1941 in the province of Jenin. His birth precedes the birth of the Zionist State of Israel. He would have been just old enough to remember the war of 1948, the Nakba that followed, and the horrible events that would unfold all throughout his teens, well into the early adolescent years. By the 1960s, he made hijrah to Jordan, following the Zionist capture of the West Bank in 1967 during the Six-Day War, which resulted in a crushing defeat for the Arab forces and a military victory for the Zionists. Consequently, a great number of militant factions from the Palestinian resistance, who are known as Fedayeen, crossed the borders into Jordan, where they continued to launch resistance and attacks into Israel, with the full support and protection of King Hussein of Jordan, a decision that he would later regret. And at this point we would like to highlight the fact that when we look at the current situation in Gaza and the issue of surrounding nations not granting access to their land or not opening borders, this is also important to keep in mind that back in 1967, when the PLO entered and a number of Palestinian refugees entered into Jordan, it resulted in a civil war, and we'll get into that a bit later. But it's important again just to contextualize the history and to understand the genesis of events that lead to where we are today. It was during this era that Azzam enlisted himself into the ranks of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, also known as the PLO. They continued to resist Israel and the advance of the Zionists from the Jordanian borders. The popularity and ranks of the PLO began to grow during this time, and many Arab volunteers traveled into Jordan in support of the PLO. So the cause at the time was very, very well received within the Arab world, but it resulted in a power imbalance because the PLO was operating as a small government within the Jordanian administration itself, and apparently there were plots to actually dethrone the Hashemite king and dynasty in Jordan and to take the reign of leadership for itself. So the PLO effectively became a threat within the Jordanian administration and society.
The guerrillas draw their support from the thousands of Palestinians who were driven from the West Bank during the war and who now live in huge refugee camps in Jordan. There are frustrated people who've lost faith in the methods and abilities of Arab governments, and for whom the guerrillas' doctrine of armed conflict with Israel has an understandable appeal. The guerrillas have set up their own administration in the camps, which are now in effect a state within a state. This open flaunting of Jordanian authority led to a crisis in February when the guerrillas refused to comply with government security measures banning the carrying of arms in public. When Arafat and Hussein finally came to an agreement, it was the king who had to give way.
Unfortunately, there was misunderstanding. This could have caused the opposite aim of that of the government of Jordan. Had we faced the situation rashly, and instead of solidifying our front, there might indeed have been a very regrettable situation.
And of course, as we can imagine, this sparked internal rift between the host nation and the Palestinian population altogether, which culminated in a bloody civil war between the PLO, which was at the time under Yasser Arafat, and the Jordanian establishment under King Hussein. This is known in historical terms as Black September, and it took place in 1970. Unfortunately for the Palestinians, this resulted in mass expulsion from Jordan and into Lebanon. So again, when we look at the current situation, as devastating as they are, and as inexplicable as they may be for the younger generations, we must understand the precedents and what happened in history when certain factions from PLO were allowed to enter into Jordan. The result was an attempted coup d'etat against the government of Jordan. It is plausible that many of the current Arab regimes are fearful of importing Hamas and Hamas sympathizers for fear of repeating what happened in Jordan in the 70s. However, with the permission of King Hussein, the PLO and the Palestinians were allowed to travel into Lebanon. However, in less than 5 years, the PLO would once again be embroiled in yet more internal disruption, which culminated and contributed significantly in the Lebanese Civil War of 1975. And again, this continued until the early 1990s. So by this point, the Palestinian cause...
People say it's a civil war. The media like to say it's a civil war. I personally refuse to say it's a civil war. The war started in 1975, officially. It started before that, against the Palestinian. The Palestinian, for reasons, lots of reasons, decided to fight Israel from Lebanon. The Palestinians were in camps, protected, they couldn't get out of the camps. There was the army, the Lebanese army, protecting them. For some reasons, all of a sudden they were armed, they became armed, and they wanted to fight Israel from Lebanon. Some people say it's a civil war. It was a civil war. I refuse to say it because as a Christian who fought and did the war, I had Muslims fighting with me. Now, but the majority of the Muslims did not take a position against the Palestinian. They took an Arab position, meaning we are Arabs, the Palestinians are Arabs, we have to help them to fight Israel. This was not our position. But again, we did not fight the Sunni in Lebanon. We fought the Palestinians, so I can't call it a civil war.
So by this point, the Palestinian cause was beginning to actually lose popularity, and especially amongst the ruling elites of the Arab nations who were sympathetic up until that point. And again, this is part of the history that we have to convey onto the new generation, that there are precedents and there are episodes previous to this where surrounding nations opened their doors and allowed the resistance in Palestine to enter. But unfortunately, as we can see in both Jordan and in Lebanon, this resulted in internal conflicts. And so it's a considerable factor to maintain when we're looking into what's happening today in places such as Lebanon, in places such as Egypt, who are not opening their borders. We have to understand the history. As much as it is difficult to accept and justify, there are very, very solid cases when we look at the historical perspective as to why these nations may not want to accept Hamas sympathizers. We've seen in Lebanon and we've seen also in Jordan that this may result in internal strife. So considering this historical record, although we can say, well, Hamas is in power now, the PLO is not in power in Gaza, the point is, from an external perspective, these are still Palestinian liberation struggles and administrations. And if we look at the historical record in the 70s and 80s and 90s, it would not be a far cry to claim that the PLO during the late 80s was actually l'enfant terrible, whose legitimate grievance against the occupying forces within its territory spilled over into neighboring Arab nations and instigated further subversive plots to overthrow governments, while simultaneously drawing to those nations, so for example Jordan and Lebanon, were receiving the ire and wrath of the Israeli military towards them for hosting the PLO in the first place. So considering this and the lack of Islamic motivation demonstrated by the PLO at the time, Dr. Azzam grew disillusioned by their pan-Arab nationalist and socialist leanings, and then he abandoned the so-called Jihad in Palestine in order to continue his pursuit of knowledge. He traveled to various centers of learning such as Damascus and Al-Azhar in Cairo and obtained many advanced degrees, culminating in the PhD, which enabled him to travel and settle in Saudi Arabia, where he was appointed as a lecturer at the King Abdullah Aziz University in Jeddah during the early 80s. And all of this again is very important because we do not want to look at current events in isolation from their historic precedents. There are, unfortunately, events that have taken place in the 70s and 80s and 90s that may have an impact, actually in fact they do have an impact in what we're seeing today in Gaza and in Palestine. The PLO and today Hamas's, you could say, strategy may not necessarily be the best way to convince surrounding nations to come to their support and aid. We've seen it in the 70s, 80s and 90s. It is not to deny the fact that they have a legitimate cause, but it is all relevant. We have to look at these things objectively and from a historic perspective. We need to look at the precedents. We need to look at what resulted in the 70s in effectively a civil war in Jordan, and in the 70s to the 90s as another civil war in Lebanon. A significant portion of that being instigated and also contributing from the PLO presence in those nations. So again, we have to look at this very, very objectively if we want to come to viable solutions going forward. In 1980, whilst in Saudi Arabia, Abdullah Azzam had the opportunity of meeting a delegation of Afghan mujahideen who had come to perform the Hajj. He soon found himself attracted to their circles and wanted to know more about the Afghan Jihad. When the story of the Afghan Jihad was unfolded to him, he felt that this was the cause for which he had been searching for so long. So by this time, Dr. Azzam was in his late 30s, and he established himself as a leading academic within the prestigious learning centers in the wealthy Arab Gulf nations. But he resigned from this position and relocated the entire family over to Islamabad in Pakistan, where he supported his young family by lecturing at the International Islamic University of Islamabad for some time before he resigned a second time, so that he can concentrate fully in his efforts to propagate and support the jihad in Afghanistan against the Soviet invasion. So this was a man who effectively was willing to put his life on pause and was willing to undergo a great deal of financial stress in order to propagate and continue to support what he considered and what he saw as being a legitimate cause for jihad, even though it was outside of his own nation, Palestine. So you can see from this that he was certainly very, very committed to the idea of jihad and liberation based upon Islam. That's a distinction here, based upon Islam. And again, this is not to say that the Palestinian cause did not have and does not have today a religious ground for the resistance. However, through the eyes of Azzam, it was in Afghanistan that he saw the conditions that were permitting of him to participate in this and to put his life on the line. Soon after, he then moved from Islamabad to Peshawar to remain on the doorstep of the field of jihad and martyrdom. In Peshawar, together with his dear friend Osama bin Laden, Sheikh Abdullah Azzam founded the Bayt al-Ansar, or the Mujahideen Service Bureau, with the aim of offering all possible assistance to the Afghan Jihad and the Mujahideen through establishing and managing projects that supported the cause. The Bureau also received and trained volunteers pouring into Pakistan to participate in jihad and allocated them to the front line. Sheikh Abdullah Azzam was one of the first Arabs to join the Afghan Jihad against the Communist Soviet Union. He traveled all over the world, calling on Muslims to rally to the defense of their religion and lands. He wrote a number of books on jihad. Moreover, he participated bodily in the Afghan Jihad, despite the fact that he was in his 60s. He traversed Afghanistan from north to south, east and west, in snow, through the mountains, in cold, in heat and in cold, riding donkeys and on foot. So this is a testimony to the fact that when he joined the Afghan Jihad, or the effort to liberate Afghanistan, he put himself in the front line when it came to offering his time and his services, traveling, propagating. In fact, he became one of the most prolific and visible voices for the jihad in Afghanistan, and drew much attention to the region from the surrounding Arab nations and from the Muslim world at large. And as a result of that, he was able to recruit many people. In fact, we'll see later on in the book that he was in fact a victim of his own success, in that he was able to recruit more than he expected, but not necessarily the right candidates. So he moved his entire family to Pakistan and began by establishing this bureau, the Mujahideen Service Bureau, which was then at the time co-founded by Osama bin Laden. In fact, he met bin Laden back in Saudi Arabia a few years before, while he was teaching at the university. Bin Laden was already establishing a name for himself as a pious youth whose impassioned lectures drew the attention and admiration of many influential persons in and outside of Saudi Arabia. One example of that would be Sheikh Ahmed Didat, rahimahullah, who attended one of these lectures actually while he was in Saudi Arabia, and was very, very impressed by what he was hearing from the young Osama bin Laden.
And Mark, we had a structure of keeping in touch with the Arabs in the Arab world. And one of the Arabs that we wanted to meet was a head of the construction company of Saudi Arabia. Construction is money.
You want to give me a test here? Okay, we won't spoil
So we
it.
sent DVDs to this gentleman, and we said, right, we should have got all our tapes. Let's go to Saudi. We went to Jeddah. We met the other guys, and this construction guy, we continuously phoned from the hotel. And his secretary picks up the phone, and he's saying, okay, we'll leave the message, we'll call you back. Next day, we'll leave the message, call you back. Next day, we got tired. We really got tired. So my father said, Keni Jawa there, Bulija. in Gujarati, let's move on. And it was one of those days that after Zohar Salah, please understand that because of the heat in Saudi, we have to sleep over, like a siesta sleep. And my father and I both slept in the hotel. And the next minute, the knock at the door. And I opened the door and I saw a Pakistani gentleman with a thobe. His hair wasn't combed or anything of that sort. So I asked him, what can I do for you? He said, is this Ahmad Didat's room? I said, yes. He said, I'm looking to buy VHS tapes. I'm prepared to buy them. My wife, my children, they're in love with these tapes of his. So I said, come inside, thinking in my mind that I'll give him one VHS tape and then he'll go away. So he sat with me on the lounge. In the meantime, my father got up to wash himself and he walked past the lounge and he asked, Assalamu alaikum, where are you from? He said, Pakistan. So my father said, Hum bhi Pakistani hai. I was in the Pakistani army in 59. I emigrated from South Africa and I went to Pakistan and joined the army. I wanted to become a Pakka Musalman in Pakistan. So father had a wash, came back, and he asked him, what brings you here? So the gentleman said, I need your VHS tapes. So my father said, Yusuf, give him the set of 10. I got shocked. Huh? Give him the set of 10. So I gave him the set of 10. And he said, so he asked my father, what brings you here to Jeddah? Are you giving lectures? My father said, no, we're here on a fundraising trip. We need money to print Qur'ans for the Zulu people. We need to print these books, how the Christians are attacking us, Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the greatest crucifixion of crucifixion. We need these books to be funded. He said, then why don't you meet my boss? So who's your boss? He said, this is the name. We said, this is the man we're trying to contact all this time. Yeah, can you? He said, no, I'll phone him now. He picked up the phone. He said, Sheikh, I've got Sheikh Didat and his son here. Can you meet them? He said, yeah, bring them to my Cornish villa. Cornish villa, I'm there. He said, come, let's go in his car. Bicharo, small, broken down car. He take us to this palace in the Cornish. We enter the palace in Cornish, in Jeddah. Ya Rab, I've never seen grass so green in my life in a desert. And like a waterfall, and the ocean comes right, and he's got this yacht, everything over there. And as we walk in, the gentleman gives us an envelope. My brother, I'm going to show you this. This is the copy of what was in that envelope. Can you please read it out to the people?
Yes, Yusuf, there's the organization. What's the name of this organization, Yusuf? The National Commercial Bank. And yes, I'm looking at this. It says pay against the checks to Islamic Propagation Center. This was 1.1 million US
dollars.
Yes. And what year was this, Yusuf? This was in November 13, 1988.
Yes.
MashaAllah. Subsequently, how many other checks came like this, Yusuf?
Well, this was a check that first time in our life we held in our hand, 1.1 million US dollar check, made out to the Islamic Propagation Center International. Okay. And the head of the name of the organization is right on top. The name of the organization is the Bin Laden,
yes.
The organization. And I'm holding the check now in my hand. So it's from this is the guy we were trying to meet, Bin Laden. Bakr Bin Laden, the head of the empire of construction. And alongside him stood a young man, humble, called Osama Bin Laden. She stood there. And Bakr is telling my father, this is my brother Osama, who's been funded by the CIA to fight the Russians. We said, Alhamdulillah. Osama turns around and says, Sheikh Didat, I've watched your DVD, the American debate, where you knocked hells into the American in his own language, in his own tongue, in his own country. You entered right into his country, spoke in his tongue, and you knocked hells into him. I watched the debate, Sheikh Ahmad Didat, and you motivated me a lot. And that was all Osama bin Laden said to my father.
Alhamdulillah.
That evening, Bakr told my father, I want you to come and listen to my brother's lecture. He's giving a talk after Isha in one of these masjids. So we said, okay, Alhamdulillah. So we went, Ya Rab, brother, there was a traffic jam like you have never seen in your life. This Osama was such magnetic speech he gave. He was so articulate. For every word he spoke, he supported it by Quranic verses. And the youngsters were motivated to join him and go and knock hells into the Russians. Here is USA, CIA. Everyone is funding Osama to go and knock hells into Russians because America saw Russia as a threat, that they didn't want them to have a ground there. So you could see that we met a youngster who was great in character, in respect, all aspects of it. So I have immense respect for this youngster.
Now the relationship between Dr. Azzam and Osama bin Laden later on deteriorated, and there was a rift between the two of them. So by the time he was assassinated in 1989, they were no longer affiliated with one another, nor were they working with one another. And this is also a very important fact and factor to mention here, because as we will see later on in the book and later on in the commentary of the book, what united the Mujahideen earlier on against the Russians would later become internal conflicts. And this again would give us reason to actually draw learning and meaning from what happens when certain factions are brought together and the result of those cooperations in the long term. He refused teaching positions at a number of universities, declaring that he would not quit jihad until he was either martyred or assassinated. He used to reiterate that his ultimate goal was to liberate Palestine. And so, in other words, although this was a man who had committed himself physically, financially, intellectually, and emotionally to the jihad in Afghanistan, he was still committed to the jihad and liberation of his land in Palestine. And there are many, many passages in the book and in other books and in other lectures that validate this fact, that he did have in mind to liberate Palestine at some point, potentially to train a generation of Mujahideen who would then return to Palestine to liberate it. And this is important to keep in mind because, ironically, it was the conditions that were brought to Palestine following the Zionist invasion and the Zionist occupation of Palestine that would necessitate for an Azzam to even emerge in the first place. So you could almost say he was a product of the Zionist program. And Azzam in another world may have remained in Palestine as an intellectual lecturing, but he left because of what was happening, because of what was actually being perpetrated against his people in Palestine. And as a result, he finds himself becoming one of the leading ideologues and the leading callers for jihad in the modern era. So, in other words, we can say that the global jihad was effectively instigated and brought into being as a result, direct or indirect, of the illegal occupation of Palestine. And it's the irony of ironies when we look at it from that perspective, in fact, that America at the time not only nurtures, but finances and encourages this global jihad, which today they stand diametrically opposed to when they support the Zionist cause against the Muslims and the Muslim cause for liberation. And you can see in a very short space of time, from the 70s till today, how policies can change so drastically, how people change sides, and how interconnected these different factions are. In fact, one gives birth to the other, which gives birth to the other, and they turn full circle against one another. So again, the Zionist state has directly or indirectly contributed and inspired the birth of the modern global jihad. Azzam was the embodiment physically of this cycle. Another point worth mentioning here is that Dr. Abdullah Azzam was not unique in his academic accomplishments. He was not the only PhD holder or the only lecturer at Islamic universities, but what distinguished him was his ability and his willingness to actually implement the ideas and the book learning that he had on the battlefield. He was a scholar, warrior, a very rare class indeed. Oftentimes we find that those who advocate for jihad are not the most erudite or scholarly, and we find that those who are the most erudite and scholarly are not necessarily those who are actually in the front line. But in Abdullah Azzam, in his example, we find a combination of both factors. We have become conscious in the course of our profound experiment in Afghanistan over a time span of 7 years and some, that this ummah is prolific and that it has not become barren of outstanding eras nor of delivery of men. We have seen that the land of Islam is still fertile, giving its produce at all times by its lord's leave, whenever the plantations find a person of insight to serve as a trustworthy administrator. This ummah only lacks exemplars to lead the journey sincerely, who are well acquainted with mobilizing and exploration, and who give priority to the commissioning of leadership. Dr. Azzam was an optimist despite all of the obstructions in the pathway to liberation. He compares the Ummah to a fertile ground, which is still capable of producing outstanding characters and outstanding conditions. The only thing that he laments is the lack of leadership. In other words, we are suffering a leadership crisis, and this is something that can actually be attested to if we look around at our institutions, at our communities, even at our family units. What we are lacking is not numbers, but it is effective and sincere leadership potential. In many ways, Azzam was a victim of his own success, as we said earlier on, because when he begins writing this book, as he mentions, it was just an experiment, which he did not anticipate would grow to such large proportions. However, as he began to publish these articles and essays, he would draw a vast amount of youth from all over the Muslim world who would attend his lectures and who would eventually join him on the battlefield in Afghanistan. And this was in part due to his simplicity and lucidity of the narrative that he composed. Despite his accomplishment and his erudition, he conveyed the invitation in very simple terms. It wasn't a multi-billion-dollar campaign to recruit people's hearts and minds. It was simply a set of lectures, a series of lectures, and a few articles that he had published over the years. But his appeal was far-reaching, and the magnetism of his words would inspire generations of Muslims to come. The problem was not in getting the numbers or reaching the masses, but it was, as he mentions time and time again in his book, it was in reaching the masters, those who actually had leadership potential, those who he considered mature enough and qualified enough to help him lead the jihad forward. Though unfortunately few of those people would attend and would respond to his call, as we will get into a bit later on. We do not deny that a large number of arrivals with simple thinking, shallow Islamic juristic knowledge, and different pedagogic schools and disparity in levels of age and knowledge has brought about a kind of convulsion in education. It has cast a great burden upon our shoulders. However, none have come to us other than simple youths, who are therefore our raw material. In this very short passage, he encapsulates effectively and he communicates a concern, a deep worrying concern in regards to the people he was attracting. He mentions people who have effectively responded to the call, yet did not possess any depth of knowledge when it came to the cause itself or the Islamic jurisdiction, the knowledge necessary to carry out effective jihad. And so he talks of these differences from the very beginning, different founts or different perspectives, different madhahib, different manahij in some aspects, and that this brought about a convulsion in education. In effect, there were conflicts from the very beginning amongst these factions that were joining him in the battlefield, and it has, as he says, cast a great burden on his shoulders, because he now has to reconcile, he has to intervene, he has to mediate, he has to find a way to bring these different factions together under one banner. But unfortunately, when the external enemy leaves later on, these differences would eventually surface and result in civil war. And there is a lesson in there for us to learn, actually. We've seen it time and time again, that these differences in methodology, these differences in strategy, in outlook, in understanding of Islamic principles and foundations would result in conflict internally. And this is something we must stress at every given opportunity, that unless there is a unification in purpose and in understanding, there will always come to a point where the jihad turns on itself, and we will see examples of this later on in the book. Although the clear despondence expressed in the words of Azzam when taking stock of the overwhelming and disproportionate representation of young recruits who were responding to his jihad, nevertheless the author acknowledges the effervescent spirit that animated most of these youth to join him on the battlefield. These were, as he says, raw material. These were the building blocks of a generation to come, that potentially, had he not been assassinated, may have been transformed and cultivated into maybe some sort of army. This is at this point speculation, but effectively the raw material that he was working with did not reach the point of maturation and cultivation, as he was effectively eliminated in 89 and could not continue his life's work. But again, we have to take stock of the fact that numbers are not enough. It's about quality, not quantity. I have looked at the countenances of the youths, seeking one of them proficient in the rules of recitation, so that I could put him in charge of the group, but I did not find a single such one. We will pass through Afghanistan so that you can see for yourself an entire regiment in which not a single person among them is proficient in the recitation of the Quran. Now, this is one of those passages that really reveals a lot about the condition of the Muslims. You know, he actually laments this later on by saying, "Oh, how we have served our people." In other words, his generation failed to cultivate the youth to the point at which they could even recite Quran properly, with proper tajweed. Yet these were the same youth who were joining him in the battlefield. And again, if we fast forward to the modern, to the 21st century, we look at the most recent example of that in Syria, ISIS again. The examples there of people who had bare minimum knowledge of Islam traveling for jihad is a catastrophic combination. Dr. Abdullah Azzam mentions that when he looked at his regiment, he couldn't find a single person who was proficient in the rules of tajweed. And this is something to be lamented. The fact that we have people in physical form who present themselves as mujahideen, but when it comes to the most basic principles of Islamic jurisdiction and knowledge, he could not find a single one amongst them. I repeat, he says, "I have looked at the countenance of the youth, seeking one, not 10, not 100, just one among them, proficient, in other words, being able to recite properly the Quran, in order to put him in charge as an imam to lead the prayers, for example." But he says, "I did not find a single such one." Very important. Knowledge precedes actions in everything. Sometimes the youth are so quick to run to the battlefield, or to run to armed struggle, or to run to resistance, but they don't run to the books, because the foundation of action in Islam is knowledge. We need to have knowledge before we take action. And the collateral damage that results from this combination of having no knowledge or very limited knowledge and rushing to actions will always be disaster and failure in the long run. And one of the things that I admire in the style of writing of Dr. Azzam is that he is very, very pertinacious and very resplendent in his use of rhetoric, which is both evident and compelling in the way his work reads. It's very concise, his books are very concise, but they're very lucid and very to the point. He doesn't pretend that his army is an army of angels or an army of Sahaba. He mentions the weaknesses where it is necessary to mention the weaknesses, which may come across as being a bit pessimistic, but in reality he's being pragmatic in identifying the weaknesses that have to be targeted and have to be improved in order for this, you can say, this generation or this group of people who he calls the raw material to attain their objectives. And again, many a times we look at those who rush to the battlefield and we find amongst them a vast proportion who are not even knowledgeable in the basic principles of Islam. You will find again examples of this in the book as we continue this review, but it's worth noting. Knowledge comes before action, and wherever action precedes knowledge, catastrophe is sure to follow. This is something that I like about his book. He's able to identify the weaknesses, and this is a good thing because it means that he's therefore able to advise and to convey a message to those reading that it is necessary to acknowledge the internal weakness first before seeking to confront the external enemy. But his pragmatism enabled him, and this is being a pragmatic leader and a pragmatic advocate for his cause, which enabled him to identify the faults and limitations from within, be they in Afghanistan or be they in Palestine. Because if you remember from the first episode, as he acknowledged that the PLO were not fighting a fight based on Islamic principles. So he acknowledges, even though it may be painful, that this was not a cause worthy of his life and of his efforts. And so this is very important in that somebody who's calling for jihad, who's calling for the defense of the Muslim lands, is also honest and direct to the point in acknowledging the weaknesses and limitations as those who present themselves as the warriors, for want of a better word, in the path of jihad or liberation. And in fact, this attitude is not only towards others but towards himself. when he says that he considers his life useless except for 9 years, and those being the 9 years he spent in Afghanistan and in Palestine. And so he is autocritical, and he is somebody who's objective enough to be able to identify weaknesses internally. And this is important, when we look at, again, to cement this in modern events. If we look at the event right now unfolding in Gaza, and we look at the cause of what's happened in the most immediate sense, because we can always trace it back to 1948 and the occupation, but in the most immediate sense, October 7th, 2023, we have to acknowledge certain weaknesses, in that you do not commence a war that you cannot continue and you cannot conclude, you cannot end. You do not initiate hostilities if you have no means of defending the people who are under your guard. This is a valid criticism. It's a valid criticism, and I believe that Abdullah Azzam would have identified this internal flaw or weakness as honestly and as directly as he did in Afghanistan and in Palestine during his day and age. It does not mitigate, it does not abrogate the fact that you can still support a cause, but you may also be critical enough and honest enough to identify where there are key weaknesses and key faults being committed. And this is one of the reasons why his books were so widely spread and has such appeal across the globe, and continue to this very day to inspire and to motivate people to continue struggling for liberation, both in Palestine and outside. As we know, many Muslim lands are under occupation. And so books like these and the ideology that he, you could almost say, propagated and pioneered will continue to be successful as long as the conditions that cause for an Azzam to emerge in the first place continues to be present in the world. Then move on with me to another regiment so that you can be convinced that there is nobody in it who knows how to perform the funeral prayer, on account of which they are forced to carry their martyrs long distances in order to find somebody to pray over his body. As for the juristic details of jihad, such as distribution of booty and treatment of prisoners of war, these matters have arisen in many regiments. Due to ignorance about them, however, they were forced to pass them on to an area in which there was a scholar or scholars who could give their decisions according to Islamic law. When I first read this almost 15 years ago, it really struck me, because you have to consider that jihad is indeed a religious obligation. It is indeed a ritual. It is indeed a pillar. It is indeed an act of ibadah. No different to praying, fasting, giving zakah, making hajj. It has conditions and terms that you have to abide by. Jihad is not just a military function. It is not just a physical act. It is guided and it is restrained and restricted by Islamic law and regulation. And so somebody engaging in jihad who does not know how to pray janazah, who doesn't know the simple principles of distribution of booty, who doesn't know about the rules of how to look after, how to take prisoners and how to look after them, this is disastrous. But it is the last thing on the mind when people join the jihad, because they are in many cases reacting to emotional urges. Again, they walk past the books and run into the battlefield, ill-equipped for what they will certainly experience on the battlefield. And again, he very candidly says he couldn't find a single person who was proficient in the necessary, the knowledge. As a result of that, they had to carry their dead village to village to village just to find someone able to perform janazah. And janazah is very simple. Janazah is a very simple procedure, especially for the shaheed, somebody who dies in the battlefield. There is no washing involved. It's very simple. It may take 2 minutes to actually perform 2-3 minutes, the prayer. But because of their lack of knowledge, even of the most fundamental principles of knowledge, they had to travel from village to village to find a scholar. And again, here comes the virtue of knowledge, that one scholar in that condition is more beneficial to the cause than all of these warriors. The pen again is mightier than the sword, but it's mightiest when it has the sword besides it, the combination of both, which again is a unique vantage point for Azzam, because he was indeed a scholar. He was a scholar, and he was on the battlefield, which enabled him to see past the emotion, past the rage, past the vitriol, and look at the condition of the people as it truly was. So he laments this, the fact that prisoners of war were being mistreated, because those in whose captivity they found themselves in did not understand the principles of Islam regarding how to treat prisoners. And we have seen this again in Syria, where prisoners were being mistreated. We all know what that entails. Female prisoners from different religions, these kind of things. Because of lack of knowledge, these people were not prepared for the reality of what they would find on the ground. And as a result, you bring more harm to Islam and the image of Islam than you do in liberating it and helping the Muslims. And again, this is something that is worth keeping in mind and emphasizing, that the battle is not just a physical battle, but it is also an intellectual battle. And those who engage in this have to be equipped both physically and intellectually. They need to understand the deen. Otherwise, the result of this is catastrophe, as we said before, which makes, again, Azzam's work unique, because he's able to identify the reality on the ground from experience and to convey that onto others. So those who are considering jihad should be equipped with knowledge to, at the very least, perform the basic duties and rituals necessary of them when they enter the jihad. Mature propagators are still the talk of the hour in the Islamic Jihad of Afghanistan, and the subject of pressing necessity and glaring need. There are still many solutions to the problems in the hands of those who are not occupying the roles that they should. The crisis of the Islamic world is the lack of men who are competent in bearing responsibility and meriting trust. Subhanallah. In other words, a crisis of leadership and masculinity. He laments this. He says it's the need, the talk of the hour, to have the right people of maturity, of knowledge, of wisdom, of experience, who would step forward. There is a severe leadership crisis in the Muslim world. This is something that we can see and feel to this very day. The men who know are few, and those who act are even fewer. And so now he transitions from talking of the limitations inherent in this youthful population. The young people coming to him are not knowledgeable and not competent in the Islamic principles that guide and that direct the jihad. And so they are effectively a liability in some sense. As he says, they're a burden on his shoulders. But at the same time, he acknowledges the fact that, and he addresses that it isn't their fault. It is the fault of those who actually should know better and who do know better, but fail to take the responsibilities and to carry out the duties imposed upon them. Because knowledge comes with tax, and the tax on knowledge is to convey it and to carry out the knowledge. Unfortunately, where there is knowledge but no action, we end up with a void. There's a huge void, and we can experience and see this in our communities, that there are the youth or the majority, the masses, who want one thing, and there are those in power and authority who actually fail to discharge the responsibilities. You can see it today. The number of Muslims who are protesting, who are demanding action be taken against what's happening in Gaza is starkly different to the response or lack of response from those in leadership and power, those of influence, those of knowledge, those of wisdom. For the vast majority of those people, there is a lack of, you could say, visible enthusiasm, which causes then a huge gap between the masses and the masters or the leaders, which eventually results, unfortunately, in misguided directives and actions led by the youth or led by those who are less knowledgeable. And so they are equally to blame for their silence and complicity in what can result in internal failure for the Muslims and continued suffering, because this would continue until we learn to fulfill our duties and to carry out our responsibilities, both at the grassroots level, the youth to learn their deen, but also the leadership to actually lead as it should. Perhaps some find justification for themselves for avoiding jihad by the fact that many of the Afghans are not at an acceptable level of Islamic training, and they therefore make excuses for themselves on the basis of some irregularities to sit back. But the refutation of this is that the jurists have documented that it is obligatory to perform jihad even with an extremely sinful army. And this is something that we find even again today. We want to anchor this narrative in the current situation that is unfolding in the Middle East, because history serves as a template and as a precedent for us. We need to contextualize current events based on past precedents. And here he's telling us that in the 70s and 80s, there were people who were making excuses for not helping the Mujahideen or the people of Afghanistan on the false pretense that they didn't have the proper knowledge of Islam, the proper aqidah, or the proper manhaj. And as a result of that, they would absolve themselves of having to take any action towards liberating the land or supporting the struggle in that land. We find a narrative that still exists today concerning the Palestinians in their struggle, that they lack the proper understanding of Islam or the proper application of Islam, that their suffering is in part due to their sinfulness and their lack of proper understanding of Islam. And this is an excuse that is convenient for those who make it, because they justify for themselves not having to take action, not having to come to the support of their brethren across the world. But at the same time, we find that there are many nations, especially particularly Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, who was very, very keen on encouraging its youth to travel to Afghanistan and to participate in the jihad. As we said in the first episode, up to 75% was given in discounts for those traveling to Pakistan with the intention of joining the jihad in those years. And to explain this is very simple, because at the time you have to look at the conditions in Saudi Arabia and surrounding Saudi Arabia to understand why, despite this general reluctance by certain scholars to join the jihad, at the state level there was a promotion of the jihad and there was encouragement for people to join the jihad. It was effectively a state-sponsored policy to send people abroad to fight in Afghanistan. And the reason for this is very simple. This was 1979 after all, and it was shortly following the events in Mecca when Juhayman and the Ikhwan stormed into the Haram, took it by force and besieged, and had to eventually go against the Saudi establishment, which resulted in the deaths of many, many pilgrims. From that moment onwards, it was 79. The Saudi establishment was first of all brought to its knees. Secondly, it was now under international scrutiny, both within the Ummah and externally, and had to prove that it was competent enough to prevent this from ever happening again. Although the perpetrators, Juhayman and his co-conspirators, were taken, apprehended, and many of them executed, there were still many sympathizers within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the surrounding nations. And so Saudi Arabia took the opportunity to basically offload, to transfer these troublesome elements into Afghanistan, to rid themselves of the undesirables within their country. 79 was also when the Iranian Revolution took place. See, all of these events happened within months apart. 79 is a very pivotal year. And so when we find the Saudi establishment being very keen to send mujahideen into Afghanistan, you must understand they wanted to cleanse themselves and their system and their nation of these mujahideen, or these militant-minded youth who may otherwise have turned against the government itself and sought to fight the government itself. By finding an alternative outlet for their frustration and angst, it was a way of effectively hedging and lessening the risk to the nation itself. And so Afghanistan became the cause célèbre of the 70s and the 80s and the early 80s. And Saudi invested a great deal in propagating and sending people abroad, because again, once they left the territory of Saudi Arabia, they were no longer their problems. They were now in Afghanistan for the Afghan government to deal with. So it was very convenient, in fact, to promote jihad in the 80s. It was very convenient, but unfortunately the blowback that came later on would cause more problems, not only for the Saudis, but for the global community at large. And again, we're going to get into that later on. Okay, so for the youth who are idealistic and emotionally driven, they'll be blinded from this. They will not be able to see this. They will not see the real design behind the promotion of jihad during the 80s, both from the United States perspective, from the United Nations, from the Americans, and also from certain Arab Gulf states who were effectively cleansing themselves of and ridding themselves really of any potential internal uprising that was almost sure to follow, because again, 79, the Iranian Revolution takes place, which drives the Muslims to find pride once again in their Islamic identity, and inspires people at the grassroots level to actually demand governmental change. Saudi Arabia was one of those governments that was actually targeted for that, and we saw in the events in Mecca in 79 later on that indeed Juhayman and his co-conspirators were demanding a governmental change from within. And so, although Juhayman was eliminated, this idea remained, and there were people still within the kingdom who were willing to carry out further attacks. And so Afghanistan again was very key because it was an opportunity now to get rid of these people, to kick them out of the territory, and to find alternative outlets. Let them fight the Russians, effectively. In 1989, a lethal amount of TNT explosive was placed beneath the pulpit from which he delivered his Friday sermons. It was such a formidable quantity that if it had exploded, it would have destroyed the mosque together with everything and everyone in it. Hundreds of Muslims would have been killed, but Allah provided protection and the bomb did not explode. This again was towards the late 80s, 89, and unfortunately this is something that, as I said before, is almost unavoidable when you have factions of people who are coming from all over the world with different perspectives, different ideas, different ambitions, different objectives, who may join together and band together initially against a common adversary, but over time there is competition, there is rivalry, and eventually it turns into civil strife and civil war. Dr. Azzam, although he was a very prolific and very visible advocate for the Afghan Jihad, had enemies within. And he mentions within his book that there were people in Pakistan and in Afghanistan who were speaking ill of him, and he would often send them gifts, despite the fact that they were reviling his name and speaking ill of him. This is natural, that when a man attains success in any field, he will draw to himself people who are envious of his status and who consider him unworthy of such a position in the first place. We mustn't discount the fact that there were some people within the Afghan and the Pakistani ranks who were not happy with an Arab coming into their land and taking charge of their jihad, of their cause, effectively, to be so prominent when he was actually effectively an outsider. And so, again, these are realities we have to face. We cannot be naive in thinking that just because you fight in jihad, that the ills of jealousy, of racism, of tribalism automatically are removed. Human beings remain human beings after all. And a similar fate befell Khattab, who was actually one of the proteges of Azzam in Afghanistan. They met, amongst many others. But Khattab goes on to lead a resistance struggle in Dagestan later on. And for his troubles, he is betrayed by a Dagestani operative who was working for the Russian secret services. And so this is something that we find even in the battlefield. There are people who will be more concerned with their own immediate interests and are willing to jeopardize the entire movement because of emotions or because of ulterior motives. And so as a result of this, he was targeted in 89 in the masjid. You know, they put all these explosives beneath the minbar, but fortunately, walillahi alhamd, he was not it didn't work out, and he was not assassinated at that point. However, they would remain persistent on this path and would eventually succeed, for want of a better word, in assassinating the Sheikh only a few months later, as we come to learn later, when he says, "We Muslims are not defeated by our enemies, but instead we are defeated by our own selves." And this is something we have to continue reminding ourselves, as per the African proverb, "If there is no enemy within, the enemy without can cause us no harm." The greatest adversary to Muslim progress today is from Muslims. I was recently looking at news coverage of the situation in Turkey right now, where the native population, the Turks, are effectively calling for the expulsion of Syrian refugees from Turkey. And unfortunately, the commentary beneath the video is very disappointing. You know, the vitriol, the racism amongst Muslims, the nationalistic urge, and the xenophobia that we find even still within the Muslims is really an indicator and a measure of the fact that we have a long way to go. And unless we can be our own best allies and our own best supporters, we will continue to suffer at an international global level. The only people who can defeat the Muslims are the Muslims themselves. And it's a truism, it's a reality that we have to highlight time and time again. We are by far our own worst enemies. The enemies determined to accomplish their ugly task tried another plot in Peshawar, Shortly after this, in the same year, they planted 3 bombs on a road so narrow only a single car could travel on it. It was on the road Sheikh Abdullah would use to drive to the Friday prayer. That Friday, the Sheikh, together with his 2 sons, Ibrahim and Muhammad, along with one of the sons of the late Sheikh Tamim Adnani, drove along the road. The car stopped at the position of the first bomb, and the Sheikh alighted to walk the remainder of the way. The enemies lying in wait then exploded the bomb. A loud explosion and a great thundering were heard all over the city. People emerged from the mosque and beheld a terrible scene. Only a small fragment of the car remained. His young son, Ibrahim, flew 100 meters into the air. The other 2 youths were thrown a similar distance away, and their remains were scattered among the trees and power lines. As for the Sheikh Abdullah himself, his body was found resting against a wall, totally intact and not at all disfigured, except that some blood was seen issuing from his mouth. It was in this way that this great hero and reformer of Islam departed from the arena of Jihad and from this world, never to return.
الله أراد أن يثبت للأمة المسلمة أني أنا القوي الجبار المتكبر، أن أي شعب مسلم مهما كان ضعيفا أميا فقيرا إذا جاهد ودافع عن دينه فالله.
Dr. Azzam's martyrdom and the circumstances surrounding this event propelled his name only further up, because this was effectively a mini miracle in the sight of many Muslims and a sign of his sincerity and the success of his mission here on earth. His books have inspired and continue to motivate hundreds of thousands of Muslims all over the world, many of whom are calling for a revival of jihad as a means of effective liberation and resistance. And we find here that oftentimes people believe killing a man would kill his message, but the reality is that in some cases, in fact in many cases, the message is only amplified with the death of a person. The message only becomes more appealing and more magnetic following the assassination and tribulation that a person may have to go through to cement their legacy and their message in the pages of history. The Soviets were expelled from Afghanistan by Allah's grace in February 1989, and the mighty Soviet Union finally fell to its knees 2 years later. And so, although he did not live to see the fruit of his labor, it was along following his assassination that the objective was met. Had he lived longer, where would he have taken his movement? Potentially back to Palestine, who knows? Now the USSR, which was a conglomerate, a confluence of various different nations actually, a number of them were Muslim nations, came together to form this united, you could say, government, this one-party government that was effectively embodying the principles of socialism and communism. Among those nations were Albania, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, the Stan nations effectively. Many of them were part of this federacy, the USSR, United Soviet Socialist Republics. And Afghanistan was going to be another territory that they were conquering, but it wasn't to be so. And that was the end effectively of the USSR, who disbanded 2 years later in 1991. Much of it actually had to do with the financial situation, because 70 billion was invested, was lost in Afghanistan, and the economy was not going to recover from that. So I guess they basically decided to cut their losses early and to depart from the region altogether, which eventually resulted in disbanding of the USSR and the creation of the modern nation states as we have it today, Russia and the different states, Albania and other states. Now, a great deal of this struggle and this victory that the Mujahideen in Afghanistan realized by the grace of Allah was also due to the media, and how the progress and how the encounters and how the conflicts, how the victories against the Russian or the USSR soldiers were being reported externally. So, for example, the Battle of Jaji or Tora Bora, these were very famous pivotal events in Afghanistan, especially within the Arab world. Events were being updated on a daily basis, and a young Saudi journalist, whose name was Jamal Khashoggi, who used to publish on a daily basis updates about the progress of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Jamal, as we all know now, would later be eliminated by the MBS administration. So, again, you can see the history has context behind it and how things evolve over time. Somebody who was once a mouthpiece and a very key component to propagating a certain agenda is therefore later on the target himself of assassination plots. And yet the fighting in Afghanistan continues as those who are fighting to raise Allah's word battle against those whose motives are not purely Islamic. So this is where we find that the initial conglomeracy, the initial camaraderie between the different factions of Muslims coming to fight against the Soviets eventually collapses. At this point, they turn against one another. So you have factions from what would later be known as Al-Qaeda, Taliban, the Northern Alliance, and these factions are fighting one another in Afghanistan and effectively wreaking havoc, unfortunately. But this is something that we come to know because it's the nature of war. Not everybody who participates in war or jihad is doing so fi sabilillah. And we know this in the Quran. Allah says, Minkum man yuridu dunya wa minkum man yuridu al-akhirah. There are those who go to the battlefield sincerely for the sake of Allah and in service to the deen. But there are also those who go there to consolidate power and to acquire wealth, fame and repute amongst the people. And as we look at the historical record and the historical accounts in recent times, this appears to be certainly a majoritarian faction, unfortunately. And so, following the death of Dr. Azzam and following the victory of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, we enter a new era of civil war and unspeakable horrors that are committed by the Mujahideen, by the warlords. At this point, they have different warlords, different factions, and truly horrendous crimes are committed against the people of Afghanistan, the women, and these are all Muslims, by the way. Okay, these are all Muslims who are violated, who are burnt alive, who are skinned, and just horrible crimes are committed. But these are lessons for us to take and to contemplate. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through what happens in Afghanistan following the expulsion of the Soviets. But we will potentially go through that when we review Ghost Wars by Stephen Cole. It covers much of this, a very, very important book, a very detailed book, in fact. But it is a timely reminder for us that at times we have to understand the nature of war and conflict, and that not everyone or everything that appears to be in favor of the struggle is necessarily doing so for the right reasons. We have now come to the end of this episode. Hope you enjoyed listening to this. The book again is Join the Caravan by Abdullah Azzam. As with the first book, The Lofty Mountain, this is no longer in print and may not be acquired in physical print. However, you may download a copy online. There are many sites offering free PDFs. If you'd like to join our other book club, you may do so by joining the Telegram page, which is advertised on screen, and the link is provided below. Inshallah, we're back next week with another literary review. Until then, keep reading and keep learning. Assalamu alaikum.